Picture a land where three rivers converge to form a mighty waterway, where ancient earthworks rise from fertile valleys in geometric precision, and where the boundary between wilderness and civilization became the front line of a young nation's expansion. This is Ohio, a crossroads state where indigenous empires built monuments rivaling those of ancient Egypt, where the struggle for continental control was decided through warfare and diplomacy, and where the pathway to westward expansion began. Long before presidents were born in small Ohio towns, before industrial steel forged in Cleveland and Youngstown built America's skyline, and before the Underground Railroad carried freedom seekers through dark nights toward liberty, this land witnessed civilizations rise and fall, leaving behind mysteries that still puzzle archaeologists today. From the Hopewell culture's astronomical observatories to the disputed election that ended Reconstruction, from canal boats to aerospace innovation, Ohio's story is one of perpetual transformation, a place where East meets West, where North confronted South, and where the American experiment played out in miniature. Stand at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers where they form the Ohio River, and you're standing at a gateway that has channeled human ambition, conflict, and migration for over 2,000 years. Ancient civilizations, the mound builders. The human story of Ohio begins not with Europeans or even with the indigenous peoples encountered at contact, but with sophisticated civilizations that flourished and vanished long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. Around 13,000 BCE, Paleo-Indian peoples followed retreating glaciers into the newly exposed landscape, hunting mammoth, mastodon, and giant ground sloth through spruce forests and tundra. These earliest inhabitants left behind distinctive Clovis points, elegantly crafted spear tips found at kill sites and camps across the region. As megafauna disappeared and climate warmed, Archaic period peoples developed increasingly sophisticated adaptations, learning to harvest fish, shellfish, nuts, and wild plants from the diverse ecosystems of river valleys and uplands. The truly remarkable story begins around 100 BCE with the Hopewell culture, one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations north of Mexico. The Hopewell people constructed massive earthwork complexes of staggering scale and precision, geometric enclosures, massive circles, perfect squares, and octagonal structures aligned with astronomical phenomena. At Newark, they built an earthwork complex covering 4 square miles, including the Great Circle, a perfect ring, 1,200 feet in diameter, and an octagon aligned with the 18.6-year lunar cycle. These weren't random constructions but sophisticated astronomical observatories demonstrating advanced mathematical and engineering knowledge. The Hopewell weren't a unified political empire, but a shared cultural tradition spanning the eastern woodlands. What united them was a trade network of breathtaking extent. Copper from Lake Superior's Keweenaw Peninsula, obsidian from Yellowstone, mica from the Carolinas, shells from the Gulf Coast, silver from Ontario, and shark teeth from the Atlantic all found their way to Hopewell ceremonial centers. These exotic materials were crafted into elaborate ceremonial objects: copper ornaments shaped like birds and humans, mica cutouts depicting hands and claws, obsidian blades too large and delicate for practical use, clearly intended for ritual purposes. The skill required to work these materials, cold hammering copper, shaping brittle mica, and knapping volcanic glass transported over 1,000 miles, demonstrates craft specialization and artistic sophistication. Hopewell burial mounds reveal their complex spiritual beliefs and social stratification. Important individuals were cremated, their remains placed in log tombs surrounded by offerings, then buried under earth in mounds that sometimes grew through multiple construction phases as later burials were added. The Mound City site near Chillicothe contains over 20 mounds within a square enclosure, each mound containing burials accompanied by stunning artifacts. The labor required was enormous. One mound might contain 200,000 cubic feet of earth, all moved by hand using baskets. These projects required social organization capable of mobilizing hundreds of workers, gesting leadership structures and surplus production that freed people from constant subsistence activities. Then, around 500 CE, the Hopewell tradition declined. The reasons remain debated: climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, or epidemic disease. What's clear is that the elaborate ceremonial centers were abandoned, long-distance trade networks collapsed, and the population dispersed or declined. The earthworks remained, silent monuments to vanished glory. Later peoples arriving in the region had no memory of who built the mounds, creating mysteries that would perplex European settlers and spark wild theories about lost races and ancient civilizations from other continents, theories that conveniently ignored the obvious fact that indigenous peoples were fully capable of such achievements. The Fort Ancient culture emerged around 1000 CE, building hilltop enclosures in villages throughout southern Ohio. Despite the name, these weren't military fortifications but ceremonial centers and villages surrounded by earthwork walls. Fort Ancient people cultivated corn, beans, and squash, hunted deer and smaller game, and harvested fish and mussels from rivers. They created elaborate pottery, carved stone pipes, and manufactured shell beads. Their villages showed increasing population density and agricultural intensification, suggesting successful adaptation to the Ohio Valley environment. By the time Europeans arrived, Fort Ancient culture had also declined. and the region was contested hunting ground, claimed by multiple groups but permanently occupied by none. European contact and imperial rivalry. The first European to see Ohio was likely René Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, who descended the Ohio River in 1669 to 1670, claiming the entire watershed for France. French explorers, traders, and missionaries followed, establishing trade relationships with indigenous peoples and claiming vast territories with minimal actual occupation. The French strategy relied on alliance rather than settlements. They needed indigenous partners to provide furs, serve as military allies against British expansion, and maintain French claims against rival empires. This light-touch imperialism worked remarkably well for decades, allowing France to claim the interior of North America despite tiny European populations. By the 18th century, Ohio had become contested ground. The Iroquois Confederacy claimed hunting rights based on earlier conquests. The Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Lenape, and Wyandot peoples occupied villages and hunting territories. French traders from Canada and Illinois operated along waterways, and British colonists were beginning to eye the Ohio country with acquisitive interest. The stakes were enormous. Whoever controlled the Ohio Valley controlled access to the continental interior, the fur trade, and the future of North American colonization. The question of Ohio's ownership couldn't be resolved peacefully. French and British interests were fundamentally incompatible. France needed indigenous alliances and wanted to contain British expansion, while Britain needed land for colonial settlement and couldn't tolerate French insurgency. The conflict exploded in the French and Indian War 1754-1763, beginning when young Virginia militia officer George Washington attacked a French detachment near present-day Pittsburgh, triggering a global conflict. British and colonial forces, along with Iroquois allies, fought French forces and their indigenous partners in brutal frontier warfare where civilians suffered alongside soldiers. The British victory in 1763 transferred all French claims east of the Mississippi to Britain, fundamentally altering the balance of power. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to stabilize the situation by forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, reserving western lands including Ohio for indigenous peoples. This satisfied no one. Indigenous peoples had learned not to trust European promises, while colonists viewed the proclamation as tyrannical interference with their right to seize western lands. The contradiction between British imperial policy and colonial land hunger contributed directly to revolutionary tensions. Pontiac's War erupted in 1763 as indigenous peoples, led by Ottawa war leader Pontiac, attempted to drive the British from the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Indigenous warriors captured 8 British forts and besieged others, demonstrating sophisticated military coordination and strategic thinking. Though the uprising ultimately failed to expel British forces, it proved that indigenous peoples could organize effective resistance and that British control was tenuous. The British responded with both negotiation and biological warfare at Fort Pitt. British officers deliberately gave Delaware negotiators blankets from the smallpox hospital, attempting to spread disease. Whether this particular incident caused an epidemic is unclear, but the intent was genocidal. During the American Revolution, Ohio became a bloody frontier battleground. Most indigenous peoples allied with Britain, recognizing that American independence meant unrestricted westward expansion and land seizure. British officers at Detroit coordinated indigenous raids on American settlements in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, providing weapons, supplies, and encouragement. American forces retaliated with expeditions that burned indigenous villages and crops, creating cycles of violence where civilians on both sides suffered most. The 1782 Nedenhutton Massacre, where Pennsylvania militia murdered 96 Christian Delaware, mostly women and children, at a Moravian mission village, exemplified the war's brutality in Americans' disregard for indigenous lives even when those indigenous peoples were neutral or allied. Northwest Territory and early statehood. The 1783 Treaty of Paris ending the Revolution transferred all land south of the Great Lakes to the United States, but on the ground nothing had changed. Indigenous peoples still occupied Ohio. Britain still maintained forts in violation of the treaty, and American authority was purely theoretical. The Continental Congress needed to convert paper claims into actual control, while generating revenue from land sales to pay Revolutionary War debts. The solution was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. One of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history. The Northwest Ordinance established procedures for organizing territories and admitting new states, guaranteed certain civil rights, prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, and promised to respect indigenous property rights that promise immediately and continuously violated. The ordinance's anti-slavery provision had profound consequences, establishing a free soil region that would become a barrier to slavery's expansion and a haven for escaped slaves seeking freedom. But the ordinance also facilitated land speculation and indigenous dispossession on massive scales, treating Ohio as empty land awaiting American settlers rather than as homeland to peoples who had lived there for millennia. American settlement began at Marietta in 1788. Established by the Ohio Company of Associates, Revolutionary War veterans granted land as payment for military service. The settlers arrived with grand ambitions. They would create virtuous agricultural communities, New England civilization transplanted west. They built Campus Martis, a fortified settlement combining military defense with civic aspirations, complete with a library and classical education for children. But they immediately faced the problem that destroyed countless similar ventures. The land wasn't empty. Indigenous peoples viewed American settlements as invasions of their territory and responded with raids, kidnappings, and warfare. The resulting conflict, often called the Northwest Indian War, was a struggle for Ohio's future. Indigenous peoples, led by Miami War leader Little Turtle and Shawnee leader Blue Jacket, organized a confederation to resist American expansion. They defeated two American armies in devastating victories, Harmer's defeat in 1790 and St. Clair's defeat in 1791. The latter, the worst defeat of the U.S. Army by indigenous forces in American history, with over 900 casualties. These victories proved indigenous military capability and threatened to halt American expansion entirely. President Washington responded by appointing Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War general, to train a professional army and crush indigenous resistance. Wayne's Legion of the United States spent 2 years training, building forts, and advancing methodically into indigenous territory. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, near present-day Toledo, Wayne's forces defeated the Indigenous Confederation in a decisive engagement. The indigenous warriors retreated to British Fort Miami expecting support, but British officers refused to assist, closing the gates and leaving their former allies exposed. The betrayal was devastating. Indigenous peoples learned they couldn't rely on European allies, while Americans gained confidence to push forward with settlement. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced indigenous peoples to cede most of Ohio, opening the territory to American settlement that poured in like a flood. Yankees from New England, Pennsylvanians, Virginians, and Europeans, especially Germans, arrived seeking land and opportunity. Towns sprouted along rivers and trails: Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus. The territorial government surveyed land systematically, creating the grid pattern still visible in modern Ohio's roads and property lines. By 1803, Ohio had sufficient population to apply for statehood, becoming the 17th state and the first carved from the Northwest Territory, a model that would repeat as territories became states marching westward. Canals, industry, and antebellum transformation. Early 19th century Ohio faced a fundamental problem: no efficient way to move agricultural products to markets. Farmers could grow abundant crops, but transporting them to eastern cities or southern markets was expensive and difficult. Roads were muddy tracks, river transport was slow and limited by geography, and overland freight costs made many agricultural products unprofitable beyond local markets. The solution was canals, artificial waterways that could move bulk cargo cheaply and efficiently, connecting interior regions to the Great Lakes and ultimately to eastern markets via the Erie Canal. The Ohio and Erie Canal, completed in 1832, connected Portsmouth on the Ohio River to Cleveland on Lake Erie, a 308-mile marvel of engineering that required 81 locks to navigate elevation changes. The canal immediately transformed Ohio's economy. Towns along the route Akron-Massillon, Newark boomed as commercial centers. Farmers gained access to markets, making commercial agriculture profitable. Goods from eastern manufacturers reached interior towns cheaply, while Ohio products flowed to eastern cities. Travel time between Cleveland and Portsmouth dropped from weeks to days, and shipping costs plummeted by over 90%. The canal made fortunes for merchants and landowners while turning Ohio from frontier to economic powerhouse. The Miami and Erie Canal, completed in 1845, connected Cincinnati to Toledo, creating a north-south artery that complemented the Ohio and Erie Canal's route. Together, these canals and their numerous branches created a transportation network that integrated Ohio into national and international markets. Cincinnati became a processing and manufacturing center, earning the nickname Porkopolis for its massive hog slaughtering industry that shipped preserved pork to eastern cities and southern plantations. Cleveland grew into a Great Lakes port handling grain, manufactured goods, and immigrants arriving by ship. Smaller cities specialized. Akron became a center for agricultural equipment manufacturing, while Canton and other towns developed specialized industries. But canals barely reached maturity before railroads made them obsolete. The first railroad line in Ohio opened in 1836, and by the 1850s, rail networks were crisscrossing the state, offering speed and year-round operation that canals couldn't match. The shift from water to rail transport destroyed canal towns' advantages while creating new commercial centers at railroad junctions. Cities like Toledo, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus thrived by becoming railroad hubs, while canal towns that failed to attract rail lines stagnated or declined. The railroad transformation happened with brutal speed. Infrastructure that had cost millions and taken decades to build became economically obsolete within a generation. Immigration transformed Ohio demographically and culturally. Germans arrived in enormous numbers, establishing communities that maintained language, customs, and institutions. German-language newspapers flourished, German benevolent societies provided mutual aid, and German beer gardens and churches became cultural centers. Irish immigrants, fleeing famine and British oppression, arrived in waves, working canal and railroad construction before settling in cities where they faced discrimination from nativist Americans suspicious of their Catholic faith and supposed clannishness. The collision of Yankee, Southern German, Irish, and other cultures created tensions, but also dynamism. Ohio became a pluralistic society where diverse groups negotiated coexistence, not always peacefully but ultimately creating a shared civic culture. The anti-slavery movement found fertile ground in Ohio. The state's proximity to slave states made it a natural route for the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and secret routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Towns like Oberlin became centers of abolitionist activity. Oberlin College, founded in 1833, was the first college in America to admit black students and women as equals, a radical position that attracted both admiration and hatred. John Brown, the militant abolitionist who would later raid Harper's Ferry attempting to spark slave rebellion, lived in Ohio and recruited followers for his violent campaign against slavery. Levi Coffin, often called the president of the Underground Railroad, operated from Cincinnati, helping hundreds reach freedom. These activists faced legal persecution under fugitive slave laws and mob violence from slavery sympathizers, but they persisted, making Ohio a battleground in the moral struggle over slavery. Civil War and Reconstruction. Ohio was crucial to the Union War effort, providing over 300,000 soldiers, more than any northern state except New York and Pennsylvania, along with generals who would determine the war's outcome. Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and numerous other commanders came from Ohio, leading to the state's nickname Mother of Presidents and Warriors. Ohio's farms fed Union armies, its factories produced weapons and equipment, and its railroads moved troops and supplies. The state's strategic location and industrial capacity made it indispensable to Union victory. The war divided Ohio internally. Southern Ohio, settled largely by Southerners, had strong Democratic Party sympathy and significant opposition to emancipation and military conscription. Clement Vallandigham, a Democratic congressman from Dayton, became the most prominent Copperhead Northerners who opposed the war and advocated peace negotiations. Vallandigham's incendiary speeches attacking Lincoln and the war effort led to his arrest, military trial, and banishment to the Confederacy. His case raised profound questions about civil liberties during wartime. Could the government suppress dissent, or did free speech protect even those advocating surrender? The controversy raged throughout the war and beyond. Morgan's raid in July 1863 brought the war physically to Ohio. Confederate cavalry under General John Hunt Morgan crossed into Indiana and then Ohio, riding north toward Pennsylvania in a daring but ultimately futile raid designed to disrupt Union communications and create panic. Ohio militia and Union cavalry pursued Morgan through southeastern Ohio in a running battle that covered hundreds of miles. Citizens hid valuables, militia assembled, and communities prepared to defend themselves. Morgan's exhausted raiders were finally cornered and captured near the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. Though the raid achieved little militarily, it terrified Ohio civilians and demonstrated that war could strike anywhere. The Camp Chase, prison camp near Columbus, held thousands of Confederate prisoners under brutal conditions. Disease, exposure, and malnutrition killed over 2,000 prisoners, buried in what became the Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery. After the war, this cemetery became a site of memory and reconciliation. Local women decorated Confederate graves alongside Union graves, an act that some credit with inspiring Memorial Day. Whether this specific incident led to the national holiday is disputed, but Camp Chase represents the war's bitter divisions and the long process of reconciliation. Ohio sent black soldiers to fight after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation opened military service to African Americans. The 127th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, composed entirely of black soldiers, faced discrimination, unequal pay, and doubts about their fighting ability. They proved their courage in combat, fighting at Petersburg and helping capture Richmond. Black Ohioans had fought for Union victory and emancipation, earning citizenship rights through blood and sacrifice rights that would be contested and only partially realized in the coming decades. Reconstruction's failure had profound consequences for Ohio and America. Initially, Ohio Republicans pushed for radical Reconstruction, supporting black voting rights and civil rights protections. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race, was ratified in 1870 partly through Ohio's support. But as Reconstruction progressed, Northern support waned. Economic depression in the 1870s shifted attention from Southern civil rights to economic issues. Violence by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups went largely unpunished. When the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio and Democrat Samuel Tilden reached crisis, the Compromise of 1877 resolved the dispute by giving Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes' role in this betrayal of black civil rights remains controversial. He claimed to support civil rights, but prioritized sectional reconciliation over justice. Industrial dominance and labor struggles. Post-Civil War Ohio experienced explosive industrial growth. The combination of natural resources, transportation networks, capital investment, and labor created an industrial powerhouse. Cleveland became a steel and oil refining center. John D. Rockefeller built his Standard Oil empire from Cleveland headquarters, using ruthless tactics to destroy competitors and create America's first great industrial monopoly. By the 1870s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of American oil refining, making Rockefeller the wealthiest person in American history. His success inspired other industrialists and sparked debates about monopoly power, corporate ethics, and government regulation that continue today. Mills ran constantly, employing thousands in dangerous, exhausting work. The industry created enormous wealth for owners and investors while workers labored in infernal conditions: extreme heat, toxic fumes, constant danger from molten metal and heavy machinery, and wages barely sufficient for survival. Industrial accidents killed and maimed thousands, with companies assuming no responsibility for worker safety and providing no compensation for injuries. Labor organizing emerged as workers fought for dignity, safety, and fair wages. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 hit Ohio hard, with workers in Columbus, Newark, and Toledo striking against wage cuts. State militia and federal troops suppressed strikes violently, killing strikers and breaking unions. The Haymarket Affair in 1886 Chicago had echoes in Ohio, where anarchists and socialists organized workers and advocated revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Most workers weren't revolutionaries but simply wanted living wages, reasonable hours, and safe working conditions, demands that owners and governments treated as radical threats to social order. The 1894 Pullman strike affected Ohio railroads significantly, as Eugene V. Debs' American Railway Union shut down rail traffic nationwide in support of workers facing wage cuts and exploitative company town conditions. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike, and Debs was imprisoned for violating an injunction, an experience that converted him to socialism and made him America's most prominent socialist leader for 3 decades. Ohio workers watched and learned that federal and state governments would side with capital against labor, using courts, troops, and violence to maintain owner control. The United Mine Workers organized coal miners in southeastern Ohio, fighting brutal conditions in underground mines where explosions, cave-ins, and black lung disease killed thousands. Strikes were met with armed company guards, strikebreakers, and court injunctions. Violence escalated repeatedly, with deaths on both sides, but miners gradually won union recognition and improved conditions through sustained struggle. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 New York City shocked Ohio reformers and energized workplace safety movements. Though the tragedy occurred outside Ohio, similar conditions existed in Ohio factories where locked doors, inadequate fire escapes, and packed workspaces created death traps. Progressive reformers pushed for factory inspection laws, workers' compensation, and safety regulations, modest reforms that owners fought bitterly, predicting economic ruin if required to prioritize worker safety over profits. The debate over regulation versus corporate freedom, worker protection versus business autonomy, remains contentious today. World Wars, Depression, and mid-century prosperity. World War I brought Ohio industry to full capacity. Steel mills, rubber factories, and chemical plants operated constantly, producing war material for Allied forces. Akron became the rubber capital of the world, with Goodyear, Firestone, and other companies producing tires, gas masks, and blimps. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base began as a World War I aviation facility where Dayton's Wright brothers' legacy merged with military aviation development. Over 200,000 Ohioans served in the military, and over 6,500 died a significant sacrifice, but far fewer than Europeans suffered. The war brought the Great Migration's first wave, as African Americans fled Southern racism and economic oppression, seeking industrial jobs in northern cities. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Toledo, and Youngstown's black populations grew dramatically. Black workers found jobs in steel mills, meatpacking plants, and factories, usually the hardest, dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, paid less than white workers received, but still better than sharecropping under Jim Crow. This migration transformed Ohio cities, creating vibrant black communities with churches, businesses, newspapers, and cultural institutions. But black migrants faced virulent racism, housing discrimination through redlining, restrictive covenants, and violence confined black residents to overcrowded ghettos. Employment discrimination limited job opportunities. Police harassment and brutality were constant. Race riots erupted repeatedly. Akron in 1900, Springfield in 1904 and 1906, East St. Louis, affecting Ohioans who had relatives there in 1917. As white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, killing residents and burning homes while police and authorities did little to stop the violence. Ohio wasn't the South, but racism was systemic and violent nonetheless. The 1920s brought prosperity but also tension. The Ku Klux Klan, revived nationally in 1915, gained enormous strength in Ohio, with estimated membership exceeding 400,000 by mid-decade. The Ohio Klan targeted not just black people but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants, claiming to defend 100% Americanism against foreign and racial threats. The Klan operated openly, marching in parades, influencing elections, and intimidating opponents. By the late 1920s, internal corruption scandals and opposition from civic and religious leaders weakened the Klan, but its presence revealed deep currents of nativism and racism in ostensibly respectable communities. The Great Depression devastated Ohio. Industrial production collapsed, factories closed, and unemployment soared above 35% in industrial cities. Bread lines stretched blocks, shanty towns called Hoovervilles appeared in vacant lots, and families lost homes and savings. Banks failed, wiping out deposits. Agricultural prices collapsed, and farmers lost land they had worked for generations. The suffering was immense and widespread. This wasn't just economic statistics, but human tragedy on massive scales. As people who had worked hard and played by society's rules found themselves destitute through no fault of their own. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal brought relief programs that put Ohioans back to work. The Works Progress Administration built schools, post offices, roads, and parks across Ohio. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men on conservation projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority's dams didn't directly affect Ohio but employed thousands of Ohio workers. Social Security provided safety nets for the elderly and disabled. New Deal programs did UNT and the Depression. World War II did, but they provided crucial relief and demonstrated that government could and should act to address economic crisis. World War II pulled Ohio decisively out of depression. Defense contracts poured in steel for ships and tanks, rubber for military vehicles, aircraft engines, ammunition, uniforms, and countless other materials. Factories operated around the clock, unemployment vanished, and wages rose. Women flooded into factories, taking jobs previously closed to them and proving their capability. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda but reality in Ohio factories where women welded, riveted, and assembled war material. The war also accelerated the Second Great Migration, bringing hundreds of thousands more African Americans to Ohio seeking defense jobs. Over 800,000 Ohioans served in the military, fighting in Europe, the Pacific, and every theater. Over 23,000 died. Every Ohio community lost sons, husbands, and fathers. The war's end brought jubilation but also challenges. Returning veterans needed jobs, housing, and reintegration into civilian life. The GI Bill provided education and housing benefits that enabled unprecedented upward mobility for white veterans but often excluded black veterans through discriminatory implementation. Post-war prosperity was real but unequally distributed. Post-war boom, suburbanization, and the post-war decades brought Ohio's golden age of industrial prosperity. Steel mills, rubber factories, and manufacturing plants operated at full capacity. Unionized workers earned middle-class wages with benefits, health insurance, pensions, paid vacations, creating broadly shared prosperity unprecedented in American history. Workers without college degrees could buy homes, support families on single incomes, send children to college, and retire with pensions. This was the American dream realized, proving that capitalism properly regulated and unionized could deliver widespread prosperity. But prosperity's geography was changing. Federal highway construction, mortgage subsidies favoring suburban development, and white flight transformed Ohio's metropolitan areas. Suburbs exploded: Palmer outside Cleveland, Fairfield outside Cincinnati, countless others as white families fled cities for single-family homes, good schools, and racial homogeneity. Urban cores lost tax base, population, and political power. Black residents, restricted by housing discrimination from moving to suburbs, remained concentrated in deteriorating urban neighborhoods with declining services, underfunded schools, and disappearing job opportunities as factories also suburbanized or closed. Deindustrialization hit Ohio with devastating force beginning in the 1970s. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan and Germany, eroded market share in steel, automobiles, and other industries where Ohio had dominated. American manufacturers, grown complacent during post-war dominance, produced inferior products at higher costs. Corporate decisions to relocate production to non-union southern states or overseas destroyed entire communities. Youngstown became the symbol in Black Monday, September 19, 1977. Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced its Campbell Works closure, eliminating 5,000 jobs. More closures followed, and by 1980, over 40,000 steel jobs had vanished. The city never recovered. The Rust Belt, the industrial Midwest from Pennsylvania through Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, became synonymous with economic decline. Factories closed or downsized, eliminating millions of manufacturing jobs. The jobs that remained paid less, offered fewer benefits, and provided less security. Unions declined as membership fell and political power waned. Communities dependent on single industries or employers were devastated when plants closed. Akron lost tire manufacturing to the south and overseas. Canton saw steel jobs disappear. Cleveland's population dropped from 900,000 in 1950 to under 400,000 by 2000. A collapse rivaling Detroit's decline. The crack epidemic of the 1980s hit Ohio cities hard, particularly black communities already struggling with unemployment and disinvestment. Crack cocaine, cheap, highly addictive and devastating, fueled addiction, crime, and social breakdown. The Reagan administration's war on drugs responded with mass incarceration rather than treatment, filling prisons with nonviolent drug offenders, disproportionately black men, creating a generation lost to prison and destroying families and communities. Mandatory minimum sentences and harsh penalties fell most heavily on poor black communities, while wealthier white cocaine users faced minimal consequences, a disparity that revealed racism in drug enforcement. The opioid epidemic beginning in the 1990s affected Ohio worse than almost any state. Pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, aggressively marketed OxyContin and other opioid painkillers to doctors, downplaying addiction risks and encouraging overprescription. Ohio doctors wrote opioid prescriptions at rates far exceeding medical need, and patients became addicted in enormous numbers. When prescription sources tightened, addicts turned to heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. Ohio consistently ranks among states with the highest overdose death rates, with over 4,000 deaths annually by the late 2010s. The crisis has devastated families, strained social services, and highlighted the failures of both pharmaceutical industry ethics and healthcare policy. Contemporary Ohio and ongoing challenges. Modern Ohio is a state of contrasts, thriving urban centers alongside struggling post-industrial cities, wealthy suburbs beside impoverished rural areas, and a political landscape that mirrors national divisions. Columbus has thrived, growing into the largest Ohio city through annexation and economic diversification. An economic diversification. Ohio State University, state government, insurance and banking, and technology sectors provide economic stability. Cincinnati and Cleveland have stabilized after decades of decline, with revitalized downtowns attracting investment, though vast neighborhoods remain abandoned or struggling. The political transformation has been remarkable. Ohio shifted from reliably Democratic in urban and industrial areas to a Republican-leaning swing state and increasingly red state. The transformation reflects deindustrialization's political consequences. White working-class voters who once supported Democrats have shifted Republican, attracted by cultural conservatism, racial resentment, and promises to restore lost prosperity. Meanwhile, urban and suburban areas, particularly those with educated populations, have trended Democratic. The result is a politically divided state where elections are decided by razor-thin margins, and every presidential campaign treats Ohio as crucial battleground. Education disparities reflect and reinforce economic inequality. Wealthy suburban districts offer excellent schools with extensive resources, while poor urban and rural districts struggle with inadequate funding, crumbling infrastructure, and teacher shortages. The reliance on property taxes for school funding creates enormous disparities. Wealthy districts spend double or triple per student what poor districts spend. Court cases challenging this system have achieved little, and Ohio remains one of the nation's most unequal states for educational opportunity. The consequences are predictable. Children in poor districts receive inferior education, limiting their economic opportunities and perpetuating poverty across generations. Environmental challenges threaten public health and quality of life. Lake Erie suffers from toxic algal blooms caused by agricultural runoff. Nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers feed algae that produce toxins dangerous to humans and wildlife. In 2014, Toledo's water supply was contaminated by algae toxins, leaving 500,000 people without safe drinking water for days. The crisis highlighted agricultural pollution's consequences and the vulnerability of water infrastructure. Fracking for natural gas in eastern Ohio has brought economic benefits but also environmental concerns about groundwater contamination, earthquakes induced by wastewater injection, and air pollution. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Ohio hard, killing over 40,000 residents and exposing long-standing inequalities. Black and Hispanic Ohioans died at significantly higher rates than white residents, reflecting disparities in healthcare access, underlying health conditions, and exposure through essential work. Economic impacts devastated service industries, small businesses, and workers without remote work options. Political divisions over public health measures, masks, lockdowns, vaccine mandates reflected broader national polarization and made coordinated response more difficult.